He is the series editor of Transforming War and the History of Military Aviation, both with the Naval Institute Press. His current research includes books on military robotics, the West Point class of 1829, and higher education in the South from 1865 to 1900. Dr. Springer holds his doctorate in history from Texas A&M and has taught there and at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Obviously, his areas of expertise include U.S. military history, the history of terrorism, and the history of technology. And he has recently been named as a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which does not mean you have to be old. Just thought I'd add that. I was named the senior fellow back in my 30s, and I thought it was such a funny title. Now I'm a senior fellow, and I'm pretty old. So, I'd also like to add that of all the speakers we've had at the 11 institutes weekends we've had here at Cantini, other than Colonel Herbert, Paul Springer is our most frequent speaker. One of our very most popular speakers. He's extremely entertaining. We have very high expectations. No, he's really going to be wonderful. There you go.
And at 10:38, it turned awkward. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, members of FPRI and Cantini, for having me in, and thank all of you for coming out. You'll have to pardon me for just a moment. I need to handle just a little bit of background business. I'd like to go to Korea, I'd like to go to Germany, and please fix the sink in my hotel room. 2 of those 3 things are true.
I can take care of at least 2.
I seriously doubt this will be even remotely entertaining or informative, so I want to set the bar really low, in the hopes that I will wind up just barely exceeding it and slipping past. There's not a lot funny, honestly, about prisoners of war, so I'm working with some limited source material here, but I will see what I can squeeze out to maybe draw your attention a little bit. Now, what they've asked me to speak about today are the dilemmas of captivity. And they said, well, we want you to really talk about captivity, military captives, prisoners of war, enemy detainees since Vietnam. And I said, okay, no problem. I will start this in the 19th century. There's a reason for that. And really, it's just an old joke. How many of you have heard the old joke? How many historians does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is simple. The light bulb was invented in 1880. So, we need to start out with some definitions. We need to ask ourselves, what is a prisoner of war, and how did we come to those definitions? The fact of the matter is, ever since humans have been engaging in conflict, there have been prisoners of war. And prior really to the modern era, getting captured was not typically good for your health, unless you happened to be so wealthy that you represented more value alive and possibly exchanged for ransom than you did dead and no longer a threat to your enemies. However, by the mid-19th century, the definition of what a prisoner of war was and the idea that they had certain inherent rights of protection began to coalesce. And by 1929, after the horrors of World War I, a lot of the nations of the world, particularly the leading industrial and military powers, came together at Geneva to define specifically who should be considered a prisoner of war. For all intents and purposes, that definition holds true today. There are fundamentally 4 things that need to be true if you want to be considered a prisoner of war. They're listed up here for you, and as I understand it, we normally make these slides available to you. So please don't feel like you have to try to write this stuff down as quickly as possible. But I do want you to keep these ideas in mind for when we get to the most recent conflicts. You have to bear arms openly if you want to be considered a prisoner of war. You can't hide them underneath your clothing and just pull them out at certain convenient times. You have to be part of a unit that has a clear hierarchical structure where the leaders are responsible for the behavior of their subordinates, where in theory they can exercise a certain degree of command and be held responsible if their subordinates engage in misbehavior. You have to wear some form of recognizable device. It doesn't necessarily have to be a uniform, but you have to be wearing something that distinguishes you from the rest of the population in a clear fashion that is visible from a significant distance. And finally, if you want to be treated as a prisoner of war, you have to conduct yourself in accordance with the laws of armed conflict. In other words, if you want the protections, you have to also engage in the responsibilities. It's pretty straightforward and it's pretty simple, or so it seems. But when we start looking at prisoners of war or enemy combatants who fall under our control in the 21st century, we find that some of those lines really start to blur. And when you look at some of the examples up here in this slide of some of the different groups or individuals that may or may not have been able to claim the protections of POW status, you can see where some of those blurring lines occur. For example, a lot of individuals, including the U.S. State Department, would consider the group Hamas to be a terror organization, mainly because it is. However, there are times when the individuals of Hamas still fall under the category of prisoner of war, when they engage in certain types of activities that would give them the protections. And so there are times when members of Hamas, should they surrender, would be considered POWs, and there are times when they would not. Osama bin Laden, on the other hand, could not have claimed the protections of POW status. He failed on at least 3 of the major categories. The members of the Islamic State, while they tend to wear distinctive emblems, really fail on 3 of the 4 categories. They don't follow the rules, they don't bear arms openly, and they don't have the hierarchical structure that we would like for them to have. So, backtracking. Just a quick brief history of some of the major events from the American perspective when it comes to POW affairs, and that's going to set up a lot of our preconceptions for the modern era. In the Civil War, neither the North nor the South was really prepared to fight the conflict that they wound up getting engaged in. At the beginning of the war, the regular army for the United States was only 22,000 troops. By the end, more than 2 million Union and nearly 1 million Confederates had seen service. So quite frankly, they didn't have the forces in place to even conduct the war, much less think about what happens when you capture enemy prisoners. For that reason, Civil War compounds tended to become really just dumping grounds. And if you went into one of those locations, you were lucky if you came out alive. It was actually more dangerous in the Civil War to be a prisoner of war than it was to march on the battlefields. You were far more likely to die at locations like Andersonville than you were should you follow the entire Grant Overland campaign. That's kind of a scary thought for us. The mortality rate for POWs in the Civil War was nearly 20% on both sides. And the major killer was communicable diseases, most of which were brought on by malnutrition or poor sanitary conditions. The individuals that survived captivity sometimes came out looking like the gentleman on the right here. This is a survivor of Andersonville who had only been in captivity for about 4 months when he was actually redeemed. And yet he saw his body weight go from 140 pounds down to just over 80 in that time period. Chronic dysentery, it turns out, will do that to you. Really? Nobody wants to laugh at chronic dysentery? Okay, tough crowd this morning. Thanks for the warning, guys. Civil War, it always comes back to chronic dysentery. So in the Civil War, you're really just holding on to these individuals essentially as tools of exchange. You're going to swap them out at the first opportunity with the enemy. And that's about the primary responsibility that the captors figured they had. Keep them alive, and that was good enough. But moving forward, POWs start to have much greater utility than just as an economic asset. And the reason why is because, number one, they possess significant intelligence value. Interrogating them can give you a lot of information about the enemy. But also, they possess significant labor potential. And during the World Wars, when you start capturing millions of individuals, you don't want them to just sit idly by in the camps. So during World War I and World War II, the major belligerents start using POWs as involuntary laborers. Now, in the United States, it was a relatively benign system. You had about 400,000 Germans here, and you essentially gave the enlisted personnel the opportunity to volunteer. Now, I work for the U.S. military. I'm familiar with the concept of being voluntold that you're going to do something. And the German POWs were largely in the same situation. However, they were paid for their labor. they did get a lot of perks for doing it, and the vast majority of them chose to do it relatively voluntarily because otherwise they were just bored to tears. Now, you could not put them to work on any kind of war efforts, but you could put them to work on things like raising their own sustenance, working in the pulpwood industry, or any of a host of other things that you could think of that would only be indirectly, at best, related to the war effort. In Germany, American POWs were doing the same types of things. They were also being given labor opportunities. They were not being used as slave labor, as some people might suspect. I know when you think Nazi, you think horrible things, and I'm not going to change your mind on that. But at least toward Western prisoners, the Germans actually did a relatively good job of following the Geneva Convention. The Eastern theater was an entirely different animal. 90% of the Germans that fell into Soviet hands died in the Soviet Union. The same number was true for Soviets that fell into the German hands. And that statistic was part of the reason that we wound up modifying the Geneva Convention in 1949 to reflect some of the new realities brought about by World War II. That new Geneva Convention was put into effect just in time for the outbreak of the Korean War. And in Korea, we see POWs continuing the fight for the first time behind barbed wire. During World War II, some prisoners did some mildly irritating things. German prisoners had a weird habit, actually, of just painting swastikas on any wildlife that they could get their hands on around the compounds. So believe it or not, there are a bunch of reports of turtles with swastikas painted on them. That's really odd vandalism for you. But during Korea, you actually have a whole host of North Korean and Chinese prisoners who are voluntarily surrendering themselves so that they'll be put into the compounds where they can then organize resistance. The idea was, if they could provoke some form of an atrocity to be committed by United Nations troops, it would lead to a significant propaganda victory. They try to organize their compounds, they engage in significant uprisings, they pick fights with their captors, and at least on one significant occasion, they actually captured an American brigadier general and dragged him into their midst. For 3 days, Brigadier General Dodd was trapped inside a North Korean prison compound, and they had to engage in some fairly high-level negotiations to get him out. Not surprisingly, he did not get to retain the post of camp commander. He was busted back to colonel and sent back to the United States. Here's one of those agitators. Officially, he surrendered as Pak Song-hyang. He claimed to be a private in the North Korean army, but in reality, he was actually the vice chairman of the North Korean Labor Party. He was one of the foremost political commissars within the North Korean hierarchy. And when he gets into the compounds, he quickly identifies himself to the prisoners and starts organizing them in the collection of weapons. This particular photo shows some of the weapons that they managed to find and smuggle into the camps. At one point, they had rifles, bayonets, improvised spears, and one grenade launcher. Not exactly what you want your POW population to be playing around with in their spare time. In the end, the American and United Nations treatment of POWs in Korea was fairly positive. There were a number of incidents, but overall we managed to retain control. But at the end of the war, when negotiations started, we ran into a fundamental problem, and that problem was we were unwilling to send anyone back home to a communist country who refused repatriation. This caused a significant sticking point in the armistice negotiations. At the end of the war, nearly 30,000 North Korean and Chinese troops absolutely refused to go back home. On the other side of the ledger, of the 8,000 Americans captured, 21 refused to come back. Those 21 actually wound up going to China, where they managed to obtain actually a significant education and a relatively good life. Over the course of the next 20 years, 19 of them came home. One of them died while he was in China, and one of them is still living in China today, to the best of our knowledge. So it's a new world. Even though Geneva says you have to send prisoners back at the end of the war, all of a sudden we're violating the Geneva Protocols and saying we're not going to force anybody to go back home. In case you're wondering, most of the North Koreans that didn't go back stayed in South Korea. Most of the Chinese that didn't go back went to Taiwan, and those that didn't want either of those options were actually taken in by India. India stepped in and volunteered to take anybody that just didn't like any of the options. So go India. Okay, coming out of Korea, the United States is horribly embarrassed because of our 8,000 prisoners, roughly 2,000 of them engaged in some form of collaborative activity on behalf of the North Koreans and the Chinese. They issued radio broadcasts, they wrote letters, they confessed to various atrocities like the use of chemical weapons, like genocidal activities, like threats of use of nuclear war, and this was very embarrassing to us. So the United States, and specifically President Eisenhower, issued via executive order what was called the Fighting Man's Code of Conduct. Effectively, this was perceived as a way for American service personnel to understand their roles and responsibilities toward the enemy. Specifically, they would not surrender under any circumstances. If they still found themselves captives, they would comport themselves with dignity and protect the rights and responsibilities of American service personnel. It's a fascinating example of us really refusing to understand the kind of pressure that the individuals were under inside those prison camps. They were subjected to torture and other maltreatment, and for the vast majority of them, they thought that collaboration was the only way that they were actually going to survive captivity. They probably weren't wrong. Almost 50% of American personnel taken captive in the Korean War did not survive to the armistice. In Vietnam, we see once again prisoners being used for ideological and propaganda purposes. Because the Geneva Convention of '49 says you have to protect all of your prisoners from the horrors and dangers of war, once they have surrendered, part of the bargain is you will take care of them and get them out of range of the front lines. That's a problem if you're fighting a war that doesn't really have front lines. And in the case of Vietnam, we decided the best way to protect those prisoners and keep them under our control was to condemn them to an island prison at Phu Quoc. Unfortunately, the island of Phu Quoc had an enormous Viet Cong population who seemed to think it was a good idea to launch mortar shells into their own POW compounds. The perception was they could then demonstrate that the United States was killing or causing to be killed prisoners under its control and hence in violation of the Geneva Convention. It really took us a long time to figure out what they were doing and why they were doing it. And even when we figured it out, we're just not good in the United States at propaganda campaigns, at information warfare of this type. It really caught us off guard, the level of cynicism and the willingness to sacrifice their own personnel in this type of an operation. So moving forward, post-Cold War, the Gulf War, the United States leads a coalition into Iraq to eject it from Kuwait, 1990 to 1991. We send 500,000 troops over to be part of this effort, joined by another 500,000 coalition forces. It's widely regarded as an overwhelming American victory. We achieved all of our objectives. We drove the Iraqis out of Kuwait. We did so at a cost of a few hundred personnel. We captured 100,000 Iraqis. We treated them well. The Red Cross referred to this as the greatest POW effort and campaign in the history of warfare. Yay! We were completely unprepared for them. We had no idea that the Iraqis were going to surrender to anything or anyone that they thought could provide protection and meals. CNN crews, in at least a couple of cases, a couple of remotely piloted aircraft actually accepted the surrender of entire formations. In reality, the Iraqis literally march across the border under almost no guard, arrive at the designated compounds in Saudi Arabia, and are told, hey guys, sorry, your room's not quite ready yet. If you could just wait, check-in time's going to be 3 o'clock. We wound up giving the Iraqis the blueprints for their own prison and having them construct their own facilities. And it's pretty impressive that they actually did it exactly in accordance with the blueprints. So camps Brooklyn and Bronx are actually built by the Iraqi prisoners, who once they're done, they just march right on in, perfectly content. So not exactly the best planning on our part, and that indicates the level of priority that this issue tended to carry for American military planners. On the other side of the ledger, the Iraqis capture a handful of American and coalition personnel. The vast majority of them are aircrew who were shot down in the early engagements over the skies. You can see one of the particular aircrew There were allegations during the war of mistreatment and abuse. Most of the injuries that are visible on that individual came as a result of actually ejecting from his cockpit. However, once we managed to secure the return of the POWs that the Iraqis had held, they did report that they had been subjected to substantial abuse. Particularly the men who were circumcised actually were subjected to particular abuse because a lot of the Iraqi captors assumed that circumcision was a practice only done by Jews. So a lot of them reported that they were actually being mistreated on religious grounds, regardless of why the Iraqis might have done it. Overall, the war was over so quickly, though, that we didn't find ourselves with a lot of ethical dilemmas emerging from this captivity problem. We only held the Iraqis for the minimum amount of time before returning them home. And that brings me to the 21st century. Because things were going so well in 1991. The Red Cross is giving the United States such wonderful acclamations, and we feel so good that we just don't plan at all for what we're going to do if we capture any enemies in this war on terror. When we invaded Afghanistan, we knew we were likely to take captives, and we knew that we would want to engage in substantial interrogation of them. From a principled standpoint, we knew this was going to create problems. What we didn't know was exactly what we were going to do with them. We weren't sure if we were going to keep them in theater, which presents its own security dilemmas, or whether we wanted to evacuate them out of the theater, as we had done in other wars. We didn't have any ground locations adjacent to Afghanistan that were going to be easily accessible for holding on to prisoners. So early in the conflict, the United States government starts casting about, trying to come up with exactly where should we put all of these terror suspects that we expect we're going to capture. We settled on Guantanamo Bay. And Guantanamo Bay is the location that author Karen Greenberg has referred to as the least worst place. We knew it was a horrible place. It just wasn't nearly as horrible as the other options, or so we thought. So we decided to pull hundreds of the most hardcore and dangerous terrorists, as we saw it, out of the theater and send them to Guantanamo Bay, where they would be entirely secure from any attempts to free them or anything of that nature. But at the same time, by not putting them on American soil, they would not be able to claim any form of constitutional protections. Now here's where I want you to think back to that definition of what is a prisoner of war. Because Al-Qaeda terrorists do not qualify for prisoner of war status, which means should you choose to detain them, as we did, they cannot call upon the protections of the Geneva Convention, which are fairly substantial, in order to govern their treatment, in order to potentially petition for their release. But if they're not on American soil, they also cannot call upon U.S. constitutional protections in the same way that other detainees might be able to do. They're essentially in a form of legal limbo. Now, joining some of those prisoners at Guantanamo Bay were elements of the Afghan Taliban military forces, and the Talibanis could plausibly claim POW status. We knew that we were in a legal gray area. So, the Bush administration declared that Afghanistan was, quote, a failed state, and therefore, by definition, any representatives of the Taliban could not claim to be acting in the name of the Afghan government, therefore could not be duly authorized lawful combatants, and therefore could not claim any legal protections. As a result, there are some prisoners that have been at Guantanamo Bay for 14 years at this point, and there is no sign that they're going anywhere anytime soon. They had no legal mechanism by which to protest their detention. They had no way in which they could prove that they had simply been swept up in a case of mistaken identity. What we found as we started to look a lot deeper into the individuals at Guantanamo Bay was that we did have a handful of top Al-Qaeda leadership, perhaps most notably Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, proof that John Belushi is still alive and well. But we also had an awful lot of people that were swept up in intertribal rivalry issues. Because the United States was offering enormous cash bounties for anyone that could be identified as a member of Al-Qaeda, Hundreds of individuals were turned over to us on very dubious evidence and sent to Guantanamo Bay in the hopes of collecting a reward. An awful lot of this was just simply revenge-taking. Some really age-old hatreds got settled by dumping your enemies into Guantanamo Bay. Now, at Guantanamo, because this was presumed to be the location where the hardcore al-Qaeda adherents were going to be confined, the United States authorized certain harsh interrogation techniques. This is a college campus protest. Okay, I don't want you to think that I'm actually showing you photos of Guantanamo. I don't have them. I have never been authorized to wander down there and start looking around. But waterboarding is an age-old technique. It has been used for more than 100 years just by American forces, and it's not like we invented the idea. By all accounts, it is incredibly unpleasant. It makes you very motivated to say anything at all that will make the waterboarding stop. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded at least 200 times. We're not even certain of the number of times that he was subjected to this particular form of interrogation. His interrogators reported they were astounded, actually, at the mental toughness that he showed and his ability to withstand this particular form of harsh interrogation. At Guantanamo Bay, the activities of the U.S. government were largely unobserved by the media. The media was authorized to come in on very limited occasions, very tightly controlled. The Department of Defense released whatever photographs and information that it felt it wanted to share with the U.S. public. But they chose this location in part because it would not be open to scrutiny. They could effectively do whatever they wanted. That was a bad idea. Not because POW compounds should be thrown open to the media. They shouldn't. In fact, Geneva makes that fundamentally illegal. You're not allowed to use photographs of prisoners for propaganda purposes. But by not subjecting our behaviors to outside scrutiny, we found a significant level of mistreatment and misbehavior started to emerge in Guantanamo Bay. And a lot of that mistreatment got transferred over to detention facilities in Afghanistan and in Iraq, something we're going to get to in just a moment. A lot of the personnel operating at Guantanamo Bay were sent as experts to detention facilities in theater, and they took a lot of their techniques with them, even though specifically those techniques had only been authorized for a small population of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. And that's one of the fundamental problems that we're facing here. We didn't train our personnel very well to know what they could and could not do. We didn't devote a lot of numbers of personnel to this mission before combat or after we found ourselves involved in it. And when we started the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we certainly were not giving significant thought to the POW problem. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the initial invasion plan for 2003, but at one point, the invasion plan called for 2 brigades of ground troops to essentially launch an armored spearhead thrust toward Baghdad, backed up by enormous amounts of air power. Take a moment and figure out for me, how does air power capture prisoners? Good job. There is no answer for that. Air power doesn't capture prisoners. It's one of the great advantages of air power as far as the Air Force is concerned, that they don't have to deal with some of those sticky problems that the Army does. In the case of the drive towards Baghdad, yes, we wound up expanding the number of troops involved, but we didn't expand it to such a level that we had troops to spare for things like POW operations. And we wound up capturing a lot more Iraqis in 2003 than we expected to. You would think that we would know, based on our 1991 experience, that POWs were going to be a major headache for us. Possibly as many as 100,000 troops might choose to surrender. And yet, we devoted a single battalion of troops to the POW problem. That battalion was drawn from a National Guard unit based in my home state of Alabama. Yay! Anybody want to guess what the primary profession of most of the members of that National Guard unit was? Prison guards. Prison guards. Used to dealing with criminal prisoners, not POWs. This is a very predictable problem that we're going to have here. Now, Geneva says one thing you can't do with prisoners is put them into criminal prisons. You cannot incarcerate them as common criminals except on a short-term expediency basis. So what do? We start cramming prisoners into a prison. A prison designed for about 2,000 inmates has 8,000 Iraqis crammed inside of it. They're being guarded by 130 people. They are under constant assault from the outside by mortars, rockets, snipers, and machine guns. They do not have at their disposal a single form of heavy weapon, nor do they have a single vehicle. In other words, they can't respond to any of the attacks that they are absorbing night after night after night. Now, human populations don't just sit there and take it. Okay? You don't just absorb punishment from the outside without looking for some way to lash out at someone else. And when you cannot reach your tormentor, you turn upon whoever's at hand. In this case, the prisoners themselves. Now, you've all seen a lot of these photographs, a lot of the allegations of mistreatment. They're not a secret. They were trumpeted by the media. They were shown across the globe. And they have been credited with creating hundreds of thousands of adherents to the insurgency. These photographs probably killed hundreds of American service personnel because they created such outrage, such fury, such evidence that the United States, that trumpeted itself as a beacon of ethics, legality, morality, had abandoned its own principles, had allowed its personnel to mistreat the enemy. It showed that if you surrendered to the United States, you could not expect the level of treatment that others had reported from the 1991 invasion. It made people less willing to surrender. And in the modern era, the only way that you can remove significant large units from the battlefield is by inducing their surrender. You cannot kill modern military units on a large scale. No matter how many deaths you inflict, there's always some of them that survive the attack. So it's a big deal. It's a big problem. Now, how did we rectify the situation? Well, we apologized. We put some of the individuals responsible on trial, and eventually we did convict them for a wide variety of offenses. But as you know, the American legal system does not move particularly fast. By the time we convicted Charles Granger and Lindy England, several years had gone past. Fighting had become even worse. But on the bigger picture, on the strategic level, how did we make sure something like this would never happen again? Did we devote enormous resources to make sure that in the future we would engage in POW operations, we would be well prepared for the safety and the control over our captives? No, we did not. Instead, we looked for ways that we could fight that would not necessarily involve taking prisoners and that would not put American personnel in harm's way. We converted our approach to warfare in the region into one extremely heavily reliant upon airstrikes, particularly those conducted by remotely piloted aircraft. Now, I loathe the term drone war, and those of you that were here last year were subjected to a really long diatribe about how frustrating that terminology is. So now I'm going to call this a drone war because I'm running short on time. We started to launch an enormous number of RPA attacks which do not allow the possibility of taking prisoners. Has it been effective? Yes, absolutely. It's been enormously effective from a military standpoint. And that's why we do it more now than we ever have before. But we're blurring an awful lot of lines when we use this type of attack, when we engage in this type of conflict. One of the huge blurring lines is the question of who is responsible for the utilization and application of military force on behalf of the government. Is it the military, which at one point really possessed a monopoly on this? Or is it our intelligence services, which are now conducting the lion's share of the deadly RPA strikes? intelligence services are no more capable of handling POW issues than the military is. In fact, they're far less equipped to do it, and to a certain extent, they're subjected to quite a bit less scrutiny, so they may not have the motivations to even try. And because these slides are going to be made available to you, I would encourage you just to look through and identify the patterns of what's happening in terms of our engagement with RPA strikes. The raw numbers of strikes in Pakistan, for example, go up under the Obama administration. And this may in part be because they're effective and the technology is developing, but I would argue it is also in part because it's not creating a domestic headache the same way that the situations at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib did. As our previous speaker mentioned, President Obama formally ordered the closing of Guantanamo Bay the second day he was in office. And yet Guantanamo Bay is still open because we don't have a solution to the fundamental problem of what do you do, I'm just going to skip through some of those, what do you do with these individuals? How do you handle these captive combatants? Where do you put them? Are they criminals? Are they military captives? Are they POWs? We don't really have a good answer to that question. So the answer that we've chosen instead is kill rather than capture. Regardless of any intelligence value that they might have, you don't create a domestic problem when you do that. And my last subject, Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. Bergdahl's kind of a big deal. He's the only possible POW that the United States had captured from our forces in Afghanistan for the last 5 years. Now, we all know that Bo Bergdahl was recently convicted of a host of offenses that effectively boil down to desertion in the face of the enemy. A lot of people have criticized the Obama administration for a POW exchange, giving back 5 individuals from Guantanamo Bay in exchange for 1 American. They think that the precedent is bad. I agree that the math doesn't look good. A 5-to-1 exchange rate isn't great, although we've actually had substantially more lopsided trades since Korea, at the very least. We're doing way better than the Israelis, who traded 1,027 individuals to get 1 of their NCOs back. So, in that regard, we're getting much better odds. But at the end of the day, there's a fundamental reason why getting Bo Bergdahl back was the right decision, regardless of what you think about this guy. And the reason why is we do not outsource punishment of our deserters to other nations. If he was guilty, and he has now been proclaimed as such, it is our responsibility to deal with it, not theirs. You don't pick and choose which prisoners you try to get back. That presents its own potential ethical dilemmas that I really think it would be a bad idea for us to run down. So, are we still in the business of capturing POWs? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that we're not. We are gradually reducing the number of individuals at Guantanamo. Its height, we've had 779 individuals sent there. At its height, we had about 600 there at one time. Now there's barely more than 100, and 56 of those have actually been cleared for release, which presents our final ethical problem. Where do you release these individuals to if nobody wants them? If nobody wants to take them back, can you force other countries to take them? And to go along with that, if you know for a fact the country you send them back to is just going to execute them, is it ethically allowable to actually send those individuals back by force? Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that one. Right now, they remain in the same legal limbo that they've been in for 14 years because we don't know what to do with them. I am fervently hoping that one of the speakers that follows me will give a much better answer than I do. With that, I will turn the floor over to any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Paul, and we're open for questions. Please raise your cards vertically. Gary Morris.
Excellent presentation on what is considered a difficult topic. Is there ever going to be a time where we're going to be prepared to deal with enemy combatants other than just
We've done a good job in the past. There was a kind of a golden age of POWs, if you will, where we actually planned ahead for it and we took it seriously as a mission. If you go all the way back to the Civil War and you look at the behavior of Ulysses S. Grant, for example, Grant comes in usually for a lot of criticism by military historians, that the Southern line, that he was a butcher, that he just relentlessly drove forward and marched across an ocean of bodies to victory. That's one that's stuck around his neck for 150 years. But Grant understood something that no other Union general seemed to grasp nearly as well, and that was the principle of the removal of enemy troops from the battlefield being the key. Grant managed to capture 3 Confederate armies intact at Fort Donelson, at Vicksburg, and at Appomattox. All told, in those captures alone, Grant managed to remove about 80,000 troops from the battlefield in 3 strokes. And he did so in part because he knew on the attack he was going to pay 2 or 3 casualties for every one that he inflicted against an entrenched enemy. So Grant really set up the idea that you could induce surrender, and that would be a far more effective way to win conflicts. The United States internalized that concept. For a long time, we were well prepared for how to deal with enemy prisoners. The World Wars, we were very, very good at dealing with enemy prisoners. Korea caught us a little bit off guard, and yet we took the role very seriously. So very quickly, we managed to put together an effective system for protecting them and interrogating them and keeping them separate. And then we really just forgot. In the drawdowns of the 1990s, one of the things that we decided to sacrifice was a lot of this planning for POWs. And when the enemy doesn't think they can surrender to you with any degree of safety or security, you're not going to get a lot of enemy surrenders, which means then you're going to pay the price in blood to accomplish the same thing that you could have done much easier through maneuver and through ethical, humane treatment of the enemy. Now, that being said, some enemies cannot be reasoned with. Some enemies will not surrender. Okay? Ideologues like Al-Qaeda, they don't surrender on the grounds that this is going to get me out of the conflict and this is going to get me a few warm meals. I am not saying there aren't people in the world that need killing, because there are. And I'm glad that our military force is very good at it. But I am saying that if you're going to engage in another major conflict, this is something you need to think about ahead of time as a mechanism to actually make the fighting of the war itself considerably easier.
Okay, Colonel Randy Lanning, Muscoda High School, Muscoda, Illinois.
Dr. Springer, thank you so much for an awesome presentation, as usual. I was curious about your thoughts generally of following up after a conflict and finding out about mistreatment of our own POWs and things like that. For example, maybe against the Americans being mistreated by the Japanese, and how effective generally has the United States been in following up with war crimes trials and things like that after a conflict is over. Thank you.
I'd say the only time we were ever really good at following up after the war was probably World War II. The Japanese war crimes trials actually had quite a larger number of defendants than the German war crimes trials did. And in that particular case, we were able to very quickly identify the personnel in question that we wanted to prosecute for their crimes. We had a number of witnesses right there in theater. Since that time, the U.S. has not actually done a very good job on following up on the enemy. And I would argue it's partly because, with the exception of the Persian Gulf War of '91, we haven't had a clear, decisive victory where the enemy was really rendered powerless and open to us marching in and doing whatever we wanted. And because Korea ended really with an armistice, for example, we weren't really in occupation of North Korea. We weren't in a position to force them to turn over anybody that had engaged in mistreatment. Vietnam, well, we know how that ended. We certainly weren't in a position to compel anybody about anything afterwards. And really, when you look at some of the mistreatment issues, even in '91, we were so excited by the victory and so interested in getting out while we were ahead that we didn't really make it a significant part of our negotiations to punish anybody for the mistreatment of Americans. Now, that may have been largely because there were so few POWs. Rhonda Carnum is one example. She actually later reported that she had fended off sexual assault at the hands of some of her Iraqi captors. But realistically, we haven't gone after anybody for mistreatment. Instead, we've actually gone after lauding people for being humane towards Americans. So if you look at the Jessica Lynch story, for example, we actually point to the medical personnel that identified the location where she was being held. We didn't really go after anybody for any potential mistreatment there.
Mark Ladd, Wayne State University, Detroit, Michigan.
Yes, I wonder, I'm interested in if you could give us your explanation or your belief on the difference between an enemy combatant who is in custody and a POW, and then your thoughts on when it's appropriate to allow them constitutional protections.
Well, I would say that one of the great failings of American foreign policy is something that Lou brought up just a little while ago. We haven't declared war since World War II. And that means if you don't declare war, you create a situation where maybe you're at war, maybe you're not, maybe the laws of armed conflict apply, maybe they don't. Geneva is pretty clear-cut. It doesn't require a declaration of war in order to bring all those protections into play. But when it comes to U.S. constitutional protections, I would argue that if you're in a state of war, they don't apply to the enemy under any circumstances. The enemy is protected by international agreements instead, but they're neither bound by our Constitution nor are they inherently defended against it. Our personnel, on the other hand, and their behavior toward the enemy is bounded by constitutional behaviors that are expected and really set out by hundreds of years of constitutional law. But I would say that the question of what exactly are these people, that is not something we've really solved. It's something we should have probably figured out before we started capturing them. We should have created a policy where we said, this is how we're going to categorize different groups. And instead, what we did in Guantanamo was really lump together anybody that we thought might be a high-value target into one category of enemy detainee. Now, in 2002, President Bush announced that we would, quote, largely apply the protections of the Geneva Convention to those prisoners. And what he meant was, we promise to give them medical care, we promise to give them plenty of food, we promise that they'll be treated humanely and safely. But the way it was interpreted was, they'll get some of the protections, but not all of them. I think part of the reason that was the way it was interpreted was, in 1942, the Japanese announced, hey, even though we didn't sign Geneva, we will largely apply its protections to prisoners under our control. And so when you create that ambiguity, you're trying to give yourself a little breathing space and a little wiggle room. But I think in the case of POW operations, you don't want to have a lot of breathing space and wiggle room. You want to be very clear exactly what you will and will not do. And if you don't define the individuals that you capture before you capture them, then you find yourself in a very ad hoc system.
Bruce DeMacio, Towson University in Maryland.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you for the question opportunity and also for the talk. I'd like to go back to the beginning of your talk where you talked about this perspective of the American point of view, which makes me think, given warfare is a global and historical event, what has the American perspective taken in a positive and negative way from other cultures and other wars that we've adapted or failed to adapt as well as we could have? Thank you.
I would say that the United States has really been the driving force behind a lot of these international agreements. During the Civil War, the Union, well, specifically Major General Henry Halleck, essentially asked a professor of law at Columbia College, a guy named Francis Lieber, to put together a system of rules and regulations. This was then issued in 1863 as General Orders Number 100. It remained in force for the United States for the next 5 decades. And it essentially said, here's how you have to treat the enemy, whether it be POWs, enemy civilians, enemy property, etc. The Lieber Code, as it was more colloquially called, is word for word the basis of the Hague Conventions, and the Hague Conventions provide the underpinning and a lot of the exact paragraphs of Geneva, 1929 and 1949. The United States is one of two sponsors of the Geneva Convention in 29. So we're taking a leading position and saying this is important, the rest of the world should get on board. During World War I, before the United States got involved in the war, we actually served the role of protecting power, which meant we inspected the camps on both sides of the war to make sure that everybody was following the agreed-upon rules. So I would say that the American perspective historically has driven the discussion of what is and is not acceptable behavior towards enemy combatants. And that's hugely important because that means the United States has taken leadership on this fundamental issue. But I think the United States has largely abandoned that position now, really ceded the ground to a certain degree of moral relativism. You run things the way you want to, and we'll run the way we want to, and there's not some universal truth or universal law that ought to be applied here. And I think that's a mistake. I think that we should be pushing for a universality of the rules. And even if the enemy doesn't always follow them, we have to scrupulously follow them, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's painful. And that's what I see happening at Guantanamo Bay, is us saying, the war on terror is so important and so pressing and it's so dangerous that we're going to really ignore some of our fundamental principles here because of the importance of this, the danger if we don't. There's a huge debate over whether torture works, for example. Does torture work? It'll certainly get people to say anything you want them to say to make the torture stop. But there's not a lot of great evidence to show that it actually gives you significant intel that you couldn't get some other way. And yet we largely abandon a lot of our principles about mistreatment of enemies. Waterboarding is torture. Waterboarding is not something you do for fun in your basement on a Saturday night. And so, for me, when the United States is taking leadership, when I say the American perspective, I'm really referring to the idea of what the United States had driven the assumptions to be, rather than maybe where we are today. But I think that the United States is in the unique position to continue to drive that debate and to bring most of the rest of the world along. Most countries, even countries we consider to be our adversaries or potential adversaries, agree that setting limits on acceptable behavior in warfare is a good thing. That there are certain things in war you just shouldn't do. And for us to drive that debate is a good thing.
Jesse Neat, Blaine County School District, Haley, Idaho.
Yeah, Bo Bergdahl is a product of our school district, actually. It's been a real sensitive issue in our small community, in our hometown, and real sensitive with a lot of people. And I'm just curious, what do you think is going to happen to him through this process in his trial with how we know how he was treated and whatnot? What do you think the end outcome will be for him?
I suspect that Bo Bergdahl will wind up serving time in Leavenworth, at the end of which he'll be released with a dishonorable discharge and essentially go back to being an American citizen, free to do anything that anybody in his situation is free to do. I mean, there's going to be limits on him as a convicted felon, but as for what he chooses to do, I have no idea what he'll wind up doing. But I was moderately surprised when the decision was made to prosecute him. I thought that he might actually kind of get swept underneath the rug. I think it was actually a good idea to follow through. If he was guilty of the crimes, and that's what the court found, was that he was guilty, I don't think it would have been a good idea to essentially say, well, you committed the crimes, but your life for the last 5 years was horrible, so we're just going to call it good. That's not how our legal system works, and that's not how it should work. So my guess is he'll be treated like any other prisoner.
Javier Aguirre, Wilmington Friends School, Wilmington, Delaware.
Thank you very much. I appreciated your historical review of the American experience, but I wondered that you're leaving out of the guerrilla warfare after the Philippine conquest or invasion. And what was our experience then?
I left it out more for time reasons than anything else. Really, the first time in the United States that we have evidence of the United States using waterboarding is in the Philippines against Filipino guerrillas. I largely left it out because of the nature of counterinsurgency creates a whole different set of circumstances, if you will. The way that we treated Filipino prisoners, we came up with some really interesting precedents. We did some things that worked exceedingly well. One of the things that we did was when we captured insurgents in the Philippines, we put them into a series of compounds, and then we effectively said, okay, what's the real problem here? The real problem is not that there are thousands of people that don't like the United States and don't like us occupying or running the Philippines. The real problem is that they're well armed. So we said, all right, if you would like to redeem a captive from the Filipino prisons that's being held there for being an insurgent, we will trade one prisoner for every firearm that you turn in. Wound up clearing out the prisons, and at the same time removing the fundamental problem, which was all the firearms that were floating around out there. Then this forced the individuals who wanted to protest to do that. Rather than grabbing a weapon and taking a pot shot at military personnel, they instead had to pursue other avenues. Now, some of them just chose to engage in attacks with hand weapons, bolos, and things like that. But it actually forced an awful lot of them into the political process who might otherwise not have done so. Now, in the case of the Philippines, we also managed to largely co-opt some of the leaders of the Filipino insurgency, Aguinaldo being at the top of that list there. We treated him humanely. We explained to him what it was we were trying to accomplish in the Philippines, and we got him to reach out to his followers and essentially say, we have to stop this destructive fighting. If we do this, we're only going to destroy ourselves. If we submit, it doesn't mean we're giving up our identity as Filipinos. It doesn't mean we're giving up the possibility of independence. It does mean we're not going to win that independence by force of arms. And so once again, the humane treatment actually proved to be far more effective than the abuses that we saw in certain places like Samar in particular, where there was a horrific pattern of abuse that did almost nothing to stop the insurgency until you managed to essentially annihilate every adherent. And so the Philippines are a great case study. They're certainly worth talking about. These guys wanted me to get modern as quickly as possible. Even still, I think I horribly failed.
James Tucker, Trinity High School, Washington, Pennsylvania.
So I have just two short questions. The first one is about, you said about the legal limbo of the detainees still in Guantanamo. I was wondering if you could talk on any that have been released, how they've been received, any specific cases that you're aware of, as well as the global perspective on Guantanamo, how it's perceived by other nation states as well as the UN. And then finally, the Supreme Court, or the justices, if they've ever weighed in on anything regarding Guantanamo as well.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to start with the international perspective first, real quick. Because you really shrouded a lot of Guantanamo in secrecy, you ceded the ground in the information fight. You didn't say this is what we're doing or how we're doing it, and I'm going to backtrack just to show you the kinds of photos that were coming out. This matters. There we go. When the photo on the left comes out, it's largely being released for two purposes. One, for domestic audiences to show, look at us, we have things under control. These individuals will never represent a threat to you again. They will never launch another 9/11. Don't worry, America, we're on it. But it's also a message to the rest of the world, and it's supposed to serve as a form of deterrent. Don't engage in terrorist activities against the United States, its allies, or its interests, or this is the fate that befalls you. It's almost like we didn't think through the idea of, oh, and by the way, we are mistreating all of your friends and subjecting them to these horrible punishments, which is then going to make you very angry. And if you come from a culture that really embraces the notion of revenge and blood debt, this is almost going to guarantee that more of you get involved in the fight. So the international perspective, we didn't release a lot of photos of prisoners at Guantanamo playing soccer, for example. Even though we constructed an enormous soccer field for them and allowed them to do a lot of the activities they wanted to do, we didn't release a lot of photos of that because there was a perception in the United States that, oh, you're being soft on them, you're letting them play soccer and you're not waterboarding them all day and squeezing all their information out of them. So that domestic versus international dynamic really messed with our ability to tell the rest of the world, no, only the most hardcore are being subjected to these things. No, we're still taking care of them. I mean, in reality, at Guantanamo Bay, the average prisoner gained 60 pounds. Okay? We fattened them up because we were actually giving them enormous rations, far more than they were used to, and they didn't have a lot of physical activity. And so these guys start putting on weight like crazy. We wound up, the medical care that we gave those guys was astounding. There's a number of heart surgeries that have been performed and the dental care that they've received. And this is not stuff that we did a good job of sharing out with the international community, even though it wasn't a secret. And so we really failed. And by ceding the ground to the enemy, who were really coming up with some of the most ludicrous propaganda you could think of, putting it out there on the internet, and our response was largely, oh, everybody will know that's a lie. No, they won't, actually. If you don't counter it, if you don't show that it's a lie, people will believe almost anything that's put out there in front of them. So we really failed on the international perspective of things. Now, in terms of the individuals released from Guantanamo, wide variety of responses from them. The recidivism rate that we've got estimates of about 20 to 25% of these guys going back onto the battlefield, but we're not 100% sure about a lot of them. We've transferred a lot of them to other countries. The Saudis in particular created a very large, for lack of a better term, re-education program where they tried to rehabilitate these guys and keep them from going back into the jihadist cause. And the Saudis claim that their recidivist rate is somewhere between 5 and 8%. So they think they're doing a much better job, and maybe they are. There was a really weird special case of 15 Uyghurs from Western China. People don't realize, at least here in the West, people don't realize just how much the Chinese government is fighting against Muslim terrorists in its Western provinces. The Chinese government effectively said, if you send those guys back to here, we're going to execute them, because we're not releasing them to go do more jihadi things, which we think will target us. And we said, well, we don't really want to keep them because we're pretty sure they're not really a threat to us. The island nation of Palau stepped up and said, nah, we'll take them. It's cool. So 15 Uyghurs get sent to Palau. They're not allowed to leave. They're not issued passports. They can't leave the island. But other than that, they're completely free. They're integrated as part of Palau society. And so they apparently all 15 of them have found jobs and are just functioning in Palau. It's kind of a weird, like almost house arrest kind of a situation. So, the variety of responses means I can't give you an exact response. And then your third question, just repeat for me the third question.
The Supreme Court.
Oh, yes. Okay, so the Supreme Court has only weighed in, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm sure some of the people sitting at the back of the room will correct me if I get this wrong. The Supreme Court has weighed in on a couple of specific cases, whether these individuals were or were not eligible for trial in the United States, whether they could or could not call upon constitutional protections. But as far as I know, the Supreme Court has largely effectively said this is outside of our jurisdiction right now. By putting them outside of the U.S., we don't have the reach to do anything. And while the Supreme Court can rule on the behavior of American personnel, it can't necessarily tell you what you do or don't do with enemy combatants. So the Supreme Court has largely said, we're going to reserve judgment until and unless you put these individuals on trial in the United States, which initially we said we were going to do, whether it was via military tribunal or whether it was a civil criminal court. We've kind of backed down from that once we realized the logistical nightmare of trying to put some of these individuals on trial for example, the 9/11 attacks. If you're going to do that, you're going to prosecute them in a federal court, you're going to have to do it in Manhattan. And you can imagine what the traffic jams alone would look like if you're trying to bring Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in, for example, for a trial in Manhattan. So we've almost punted on that issue. You're welcome.
Ron Keller, Lincoln College, Lincoln, Illinois.
Thank you for your presentation. I guess I sort of struggle with what I perceive to be somewhat hypocrisy on the part of American policy. Then when we have POWs somewhere else in the world, we immediately send for, you do not hold our people. But yet I guess I'm bothered by the lack of outrage I've seen over Guantanamo Bay. I had a conversation not long ago with I'm from Illinois, and our Senator Dick Durbin, and I asked Senator Durbin, who's always been opposed to Guantanamo Bay, why are we not closing this down? The President has often said this is an affront to American values, and he simply passed it off saying, we just don't have the votes in Congress, and move on. And I see that even with my students, when I sort of explore this both sides of this, they say, well, we have to do what we have to do. And I guess you've alluded to this already, but I guess I just feel that this American exceptionalism, which Mr. McDougall talked about earlier, I think we're losing that. And I feel that if we are stooping down to the level of what terrorists do, we are no better than them. And I'm very passionate about this, and I just feel that as a son of a veteran, our American foreign policy, our American military might, what we stand for in this country is severely compromised by what we're doing here. And I'm sorry, I don't have the speaker's podium. I don't know if this is even a question, but how do we convince leadership, or is leadership just not doing anything because they're struggling with it too? How do we avoid this problem in the future? I guess where do we go from here?
See, there's a question. There was a question hiding in there all along, right? And like any speaker with a microphone now, I'll just reinterpret the question to be whatever I want it to be. So Senator Durbin was right. There's not the votes to close Guantanamo, but that's largely because nobody seems to be able to come up with a better alternative. When Karen Greenberg referred to it as the least worst place, she was right. We don't have a good plan for what to do with those people. I mean, at the end of the day, I suppose you could execute them all if you wanted to, and that would solve your problem, sort of. But it would be a terrible solution, horribly unconstitutional, and fundamentally violate what we stand for as the United States. Now, I would argue you've created a false dichotomy when you say we're sinking to the level of the terrorists because what we're doing at Guantanamo Bay is kind of nasty. Because we're not deliberately targeting civilians. We're not engaging in acts of terrorism. We are compromising our values sometimes. And that does happen in war. At the end of the day, when reality meets idealism, sometimes reality trumps idealism. And I think that's what happened at Guantanamo Bay, was a perception that you've got to capture these guys and you've got to do something with them. Now, the security problem in Afghanistan is part of the reason that Guantanamo exists. When we initially started holding people at places like Bagram, we found we couldn't hold them because there was just too many enemy personnel that might potentially launch attacks. We didn't have enough forces to devote to this particular issue, and there were a number of significant breakouts where the worst case scenario, as far as we were concerned, was you capture these individuals, but then you can't exploit any intelligence and you can't hold on to them. They break loose, and now they're an even bigger, more charismatic hero launching even more attacks. But I wish I had a better answer for you in terms of where do we go from here, what do we do from here. I don't think the answer should be, let's fight a war where we can't capture anyone. And that seems to be our approach right now against the Islamic State. We'll go ahead and engage in the fighting, and we'll launch airstrikes, but we're not going to capture anybody because we don't have any boots on the ground. But don't worry, the Iraqis have it under control, and they've got a reputation for being great with prisoners, so I'm sure that'll work out. I'm sure that'll work out wonderfully. Geneva does say that if you're working with another country or if you turn POWs over to another country, you still bear responsibility to ensure that their treatment is in keeping with the tenets of international law. And so if we essentially facilitate the Iraqis capturing a whole lot of POWs, we bear at least a certain degree of moral responsibility for what the Iraqis do with them. We saw that in Vietnam in particular. We really didn't want to handle the POW problem, so we turned over the vast majority of the ones that we captured over to the South Vietnamese government, who then engaged in a whole lot of really horrible behaviors. And the International Committee of the Red Cross called us out on it and said, look, you are allowing these guys to be burned, to be electrocuted, to be confined in tiger cages, to be tortured. You, the United States, need to step up and take ownership of the problem. And we effectively said the same thing to the Red Cross that Andrew Jackson said to the Supreme Court when they declared what he had to do in terms of the Cherokees. And that was, all right, the Red Cross has made their decision, let them enforce it. Yeah. We punted, and we didn't get held responsible for it, so that created a pattern of the same behavior.
General Charles Dunlap, Director of the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security at Duke University, one of our later speakers.
It was guaranteed one of the back row was going to tell me where I was wrong.
So busy writing down all my questions of your wonderful, provocative presentation. I have a couple of questions. Number one, that photo that you have up there, are you saying that was released by the U.S. government, or was that taken by a journalist who was allowed in?
That is a DOD photo.
And isn't releasing photographs violative
You're allowed to take photos of POWs as groups like this. You're not allowed to take and release photos of them as individuals.
And isn't that one of the problems with releasing a lot of information about Gitmo, not to mention the security issue? And would you say that Gitmo today is better or worse a facility than Rikers Island or any state prison in Illinois? I've been there, and I would suggest that maybe not. In fact, it may be a good place in terms of that.
It is. You're absolutely right. Gitmo today, having had the time to build up the facilities, is now in many ways a model incarceration facility. It wasn't that way in 2001, 2002. It took years to really build that up. But yes, now Gitmo, I'm not saying I'd rather be there than here, but it's a near second.
And thirdly, with relation to Bergdahl, would you not say that the Bobby Gargo case might be parallel to this answer to this gentleman's question? Bobby Gargo did a lot worse things than Bergdahl when he was a POW. And when he was court-martialed, he was dishonored with discharge, but he wasn't subjected to any further incarceration.
Well, let me address that real quick, and I would just say, yes, there's a parallel there. Bergdahl is not being prosecuted for what he did while he was in enemy captivity. Bergdahl is being prosecuted for walking away from his post.
But what I guess we can debate the point, but in my view, what Gargo did to other POWs was more egregious than arguably what Bergdahl was.
Absolutely.
Third thing, when we talk about waterboarding in the Philippines campaign, aren't we really talking about the water cure, which is a fundamentally different process than what waterboarding was? Because the water cure involved actually forcing water into somebody's stomach in a way that could actually kill them, and that's what was done during the Philippine insurrections.
Actually, in the Philippines, we did both. The water cure, you basically force someone's mouth open, jam a funnel inside their mouth, and pour dirty swamp water down their throat, 1 or 2 gallons, as much as you could cram into their stomach. Then you kick them in the stomach till they throw it back up, and then you repeat the process. Waterboarding, on the other hand, is far less likely to rupture your stomach and cause internal bleeding to the point of death. We did both in the Philippines. The wide variety of water cures, because that was the term that was used for all of the above, that we used in the Philippines is mind-boggling. We were very good at experimentation.
Just to clarify, so you're saying that the waterboarding technique that was used on
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? Or on Filipinos?
saying this was used during the Philippines?
I'm saying during the Philippine War we used both. We did the water cure that you're referring to. We also engaged in waterboarding, which is an old technique where you place a cloth or some other porous fiber over someone's face and pour water down to simulate the feeling of drowning. We did both in the Philippine War. My advisor was Brian Lynn. He's the Philippine War guy, and believe me, he drilled this into my skull.
Yeah, because I've looked and I've never seen.
Sure. I can send you the references if you want to see them.
You're suggesting that, am I correct in understanding that you're suggesting that we ought to treat everybody as a POW, and as opposed to conforming with Common Article 3? And the reason I'm concerned about that is that incentivizes people not to conform to the things that they should conform to get POW status.
No, I am not arguing that. I'm not arguing that we should treat everyone as a POW. I am arguing we should clarify who's going to be treated as a POW before engaging in conflict, and that we should plan ahead for the POWs that we anticipate capturing. You don't give blanket protections to individuals that don't deserve them, because it really mars the point of setting standards in the first place. But you do illustrate exactly how you're going to treat the enemy before you start shooting at them or potentially capturing them, because otherwise you fall into an improvisational situation where your solution is not going to be as effective as it could be. So no, I'm not arguing you give POW protections to all these guys.
But don't you think that the Army AR 190-8 kind of does that because it sets up Article 5 tribunals? I mean, isn't that part of the planning
No, because you don't subject POWs to tribunals.
Yes, you do.
You only subject POWs to tribunals if they are guilty of a crime while as a POW.
An Article 5 tribunal would determine the status of an
Okay, I thought you were talking about the criminal tribunals.
Well, and I've never seen a war plan ever that didn't have a plan for POWs. It has a plan, it may not be adequate, and it may be difficult to implement on the battlefield, but I think we do have plans typically in most of our war plans.
But a plan that calls for you to do something you can't do because you haven't devoted any resources to it is a fantasy at best. It's an illusion. When you look at the 91 plan even, yes, there's a paragraph in the war plan that says we expect to capture a whole lot of prisoners and we will turn them over to the Saudis for incarceration. It's not fleshed out. There's nobody directly attached to the mission. You gave it a nod in the plan, but you didn't actually commit any resources to carry out what you said you were going to do. And what I'm saying is you need to commit the resources ahead of time. I'm saying that very inadequate resources were devoted to the idea. I mean, we spent 6 months building up in the desert prior to Desert Storm, and yet the POW compounds weren't built until the Iraqis showed up. That's not committing sufficient resources to the mission. That's telling you that it doesn't matter, or that you don't think you're going to capture prisoners. We knew full well we were going to capture prisoners, therefore, it wasn't a particularly important aspect of our plan. If the prisoners themselves could construct their facilities in a matter of a couple of days, then it wasn't well-resourced prior to the conflict.
We'll have to go on to someone else now. John Underwood, the Paulding County High School, Dallas, Georgia.
Not sure I want to get into the middle of this one, but I did want to bring up, for good, bad, and different, I was in the Army headquarters that planned for the 2003 invasion, but do you think it was more a matter of political expediency that, there was that obligatory paragraph in there that's been in the war plans for some time, but it was really more a matter of if you start putting a lot of units against POWs and other things, that is now, oh no, we're getting into a long-term issue, that we're going to be there a while, and that's not what we're trying to sell to the American people, a short-term conflict, and we're going to depart. And it was more a political decision than it was one of the military, because I personally, good, bad, and different, spent about a month of my life during that time frame trying to plan on how to eradicate the date palm dumas, so right after we invaded, we could then get the date planning back on track, because that was one of their major cash crops.
Yeah, I'm certain that politics played a significant role in that decision-making. I would argue that while the military has to be cognizant of the political realities, military planning should not be necessarily overcome by political expediency. I don't think that's a good precedent for us to set. And in that particular case, we didn't devote a whole lot of attention to it. We didn't devote a whole lot of personnel to it. I think the military really shows you how much they do or don't value a mission based on which units are tasked with it. POW operations are not glamorous. They're not sexy. They're not exciting. And they tend to be almost entirely outsourced to Guard and Reserve units now. But Guard and Reserve units, by definition, don't spend nearly as much time planning or preparing for this type of activity. And Guard and Reserve units are usually called up pretty late in the cycle when you decide that you're going to engage in a conflict. And then there's the significant lead-up and call-up period. I think it says a lot, though, when you decide that you're going to basically outsource this to these part-time forces that you call up in the wartime emergency, and you don't devote a whole lot of time to even telling them what the mission's going to be. That's my take.
I think this will have to be the last question. Arthur Sear from Carthage College.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks to our speaker. On your earlier discussion of the Supreme Court and due process, is it not true that our Supreme Court has been explicit and assertive in stating that you have to do something? You cannot simply follow the Rumsfeld dictum that these people deserve nothing. They can stay in legal and ethical limbo forever. Related to that, especially for teachers, the Wall Street Journal, several years into the U.S. occupation of Iraq, had a very good series of articles underscoring the important role of JAG personnel, military lawyers, in pressing for some kind of basic respect to the English and Scottish principle of due process and someday in court, some kind of tribunal.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with you. The Supreme Court did say, yeah, you need to do something. I'm not sure that I would really classify that as weighing in. I certainly wouldn't say it was proscriptive so much as, hey guys, figure it out. Your current solution isn't good enough. And so, yeah, I would say they got involved in that regard, but I would also say that the Supreme Court did not lay down guidelines for here's how you're going to do this or here's how you're going to do that. Sure, 100% agree.
Okay, thank you very much.